see if that works. There we go. Okay, we're up and we're running. So the reason I wanted to walk through kind of my experience of being assigned it my freshman year of college, being assigned it again my junior year of college, and then finally reading it as a deacon, is to say this, and I mean this without any sense of judgment or any sense of, belittling or anything like that. A lot of times what I've heard is people say, this is too much, I can't get it. It doesn't make sense to me, it's not clicking. And then I hear exactly what you said, so I really appreciate you saying it, is that the first time you said you picked up the book, you said you felt like you were on the outside of the castle, among all the vermin and critters and stinging thingies and whatnot, right? And I think that's part of the issue here, is that it is a difficult book for someone who is very new to, and I don't want to say the practice of the faith, but maybe the practice of the spiritual life. So the intentional taking on of the spiritual life. So that doesn't mean that the person who struggles with this is a bad Catholic or is an unholy sinner or anything of that nature. It's that when we're very new to the intentional spiritual life, when we're just embarking on it, we pick up someone like Teresa of Avila, a mystic of the church, a doctor of spirituality. Okay, she's phenomenal, she's fantastic. But she is, in humility, I'm like, if we're going to do a scale of spiritual advancement of 0 to 100, I might be like a 31. She's a 890, right? So she's beyond the scale, and it's going to take someone who's not a 2 to pick up. When I was 17, I was like a 1.5. Okay, you know what I mean? So it's just before you begin to really study the spiritual life, you have to have a spiritual life. And the spiritual life, a lot of times, has to be more than just, I'm at Mass. It has to be this, I'm seeking something deeper. And the more that I seek something deeper, the more that I'll understand what people like Teresa of Avila are saying about seeking a deeper spiritual life. Does that make sense? Does that resonate? So the reason I chose this book now is because I was hoping that a lot of the people who did the book study last Lent with Brant Petra's Introduction to the Spiritual Life, which I found very approachable, very easy. I hope you did too. I wanted to say, okay, we've done that, and hopefully we take some of what Brant Petra suggested and put it into practice over the last year. And then so now with this Lent approaching, we've been doing those practices of prayer, of contemplation, of rote prayer, of meditation, of mental prayer, of evaluating the moral life, of going to confession and ridding sin. So what you notice is very naturally, if you're doing that, you're passing through the first mansion. So the idea was to use Brant Petra, pass through the first mansion or two, and then get into Teresa of Avila and really start to dig. Does that? Okay.
Good plan.
Let's see if it works. I can plan all the great things I want. That doesn't mean it's going to work, though. Okay. Did anything in the first 3 mansions stand out? Let's just start with that first mansion. By the way, this is my original copy that I bought in 2009. It's all beat up, and it has all kinds of notes through it, which made it harder to read. The beauty of the soul?
Beauty and dignity of the soul.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And maybe even the motivation to clean it up, right? To clean up all the vermin, so to speak, that plague the soul. Did everybody read the introduction?
Yes.
Okay, the introduction is important for this book. Why read a book like this? I think there's 2 reasons. I think it's laid out in the introduction pretty clearly. The 2 reasons, I think, one is self-knowledge. So to be honest with myself, where am I? Now, I want to stop right there, because that is a very important question to dig into for the entirety of this book. Because the temptation reading this is to say, I'm in the 4th mansion, and now I have to do X, Y, and Z to get into the 5th mansion. Do not do that. Do not adapt that attitude. The reason is the spiritual life is not a science. So the temptation here is going to say, here is the exact plan, path, practice that I have to undertake to become advanced in the spiritual life. If you do that, you will drive yourself insane, because even looking at something like this, we're moving from mansion to mansion, from the external courtyard into the internal of my soul. To do something like this, I have to remember, this is not progress on a medical journey. Right? I'm not trying to find the symptom, okay, it's such disease, penicillin will kill it, do that and it's over. No. And medicine's more complicated than that. This is more complicated than that, because this is not science. It's a relationship. No relationship is that simple. She does say that. She does, and I'm drilling it in because I really want to make sure that we don't do that. Because even though she said it, guess what 24-year-old Deacon Nicholas did? He walked into his spiritual director's office and said, "Father, I'm in mansion number 4. Father Peter looked at me and said, "I don't care." And he's the one that has signed the book, right? So I'm just drilling it home. That's all. Because it's just not healthy. The relationship with God is complex. But I want to remind everyone of this lesson, and this is a hard one for me to keep in mind. The spiritual life and my relationship with the Lord God, if there's something wrong in my relationship, it's not Him. Right? Every other relationship in my life, if it's me and my friend, it could be me. It could be him. If it's me and a parishioner, it's probably the parishioner. Right? If it's me and the bishop, it's definitely the bishop. But if it's me and God, without a doubt, it's my fault. I did something to hinder my relationship with God. God never does anything to hinder a relationship with me. God sometimes withdraws. And we'll get into this later, but I just want to kind of put all this kind of out there as an introduction. God does sometimes withdraw. And He can withdraw, we call it spiritual desolation, when it feels as if God has withdrawn. Desolation can be caused by a number of things. Number one, it can be related to a natural desolation. I'll give you, for instance. I don't think I've ever had allergies in my life until Saturday morning. And all of a sudden, I couldn't breathe. I felt fatigued. I have post-nasal drip. I've got a runny nose, and I have no fever. And the only thing that cured, cold medicine didn't touch it. I took an antihistamine, and just like that. Well, I've been either feeling like a groggy mess, or I've been hyped up on antihistamine. So guess who's in a natural state of desolation right now? Me, because I'm all out of whack. Well, guess what the natural state of desolation does? It can cause a spiritual desolation. God feels distant. Why does God feel distant? Because my brain's not functioning the way it needs to function. I can't remember people's names right now because I don't feel well, you know? So that, number one, I can be in a spiritual desolation because there's a natural, and it can be something more severe than that, like someone that I love dearly dies, a hurricane hits, I don't know, I lost $300 on the craps table, whatever, right? So there's all sorts of things that can cause a spiritual desolation that just relate to the natural life. Number two, it could be sin. You know, you hear me preach constantly, and I would say I preach it ad nauseum. Go to confession. Go to confession. Go to confession. And I'm going to keep saying it, because I know how many confessions I hear and I know how many people are in my pews. Go to confession. Because if you're not regularly going to confession, what happens? Sin clogs. It clogs my spiritual ears. It clogs my spiritual eyes. I can't see God. I can't hear God. Particularly the sins of pride. They will always block me from God. So if I'm full of sin, whether it's one big mortal sin or 1,000 venial sins, if I'm crusted over with sin, I'm going to be in a spiritual desolation. That's a given. Make sense? Okay. And then another reason I can be in a spiritual desolation is because it's a period of growth. Period of growth. Sometimes God allows me to feel his absence because I can't grow when I'm too close to him. I can't grow if I stay on Mount Tabor, like in the Transfiguration, right? Jesus' flesh, his clothes shine like the sun, and Peter says to him, Lord, let's build 3 tents and just stay here, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. He doesn't, and then what does Luke say? He didn't know what he was saying. He didn't know what he's talking about. And then the cloud goes away, Moses and Elijah disappear, and they descend the mountain. You can't stay on the mountain. You won't grow. You have to go down. And so the time in the valley there is a spiritual desolation. The fourth and maybe final thing that causes spiritual desolation is because you're not showing up to prayer. Right? I got all the time in college, seminary, when I was a young, stupid, naive, prideful seminarian. I would just, I'd oversleep and skip holy hour. Don't tell the Archbishop. He knows at this point. You know, and then after a couple days of doing that, I would go complain to Father Gitter, my spiritual director at the time, and I'd say, I'm in such spiritual desolation. And he would look at me and say, well, Nicholas, I haven't seen you in the chapel in 3 days. Why do you think you're in desolation? Not God's fault. It's mine. So if I'm in spiritual desolation, what are the 4? What do I do? Number 1, I go to confession. Easy, right? Because if it's caused by sin, it'll immediately be lifted. Go to confession. All right, if it's not that, well, what's going on in my life? Am I ill right now? Okay, well, go pray through the illness, especially if it's a chronic illness, a new diagnosis or something. You have to pray into that illness. You have to pray into the uncomfortability. You have to go all the way into the suffering and meet Jesus on the cross. You meet him on the cross in the middle of your suffering, and your prayer life will grow exponentially, I promise. If it's a cold, just wait it out. You'll get through it, right? If it's because you're not praying, what do? Pray. If you're praying, but you're still remaining, okay, you've gone to confession, you value your life, your cold has passed, and you're praying, and you're still in desolation, what do? Pray more. So if you're doing a holy hour, you're going to do a holy 65 minutes. You pray more, okay? Because the devil will use any form of desolation to cause you to stop. If you withdraw from God, the devil wins. And this is where the growth takes place. This is where the spiritual life will deepen. Does that make sense? Because if you're in desolation, no matter the cause, and you've gone to confession, you've begun to pray more, you've dealt with your suffering, and you're still in desolation, what's the devil trying to do? Pull you away from God. What is God trying to do? Strengthen your muscle. You don't strengthen muscle without ripping it, right? So you have to keep going. Okay. I just want to lay those out just as pieces of advice as we go through this. And those are kind of more along the things, as we talk about the mansions and the particularities of the mansions, to keep in mind. Just those basic spiritual principles of keep going. It's relationship. It's not a science. It's not a magical equation. It's not a fairy tale. This is real life. Okay? The other reason that Teresa of Avila writes this, does anybody remember? She's another. Well, yes. Okay. So, yeah, I was overlooking that reason, but yes, out of holy obedience, you always do what you have to. Yeah, she wanted to encourage. She writes it to encourage, to build people up. So this is, and that I think is another reason why you can't look at the mansions and try to evaluate, oh, woe is me, I'm only in the courtyard among the vermin and the scorpions. Because that's not, again, that's just discouragement. That's not the point of this. The point of this is encouragement, to say, I might be among the vermin, but the door's open. So keep going. Okay? All right. First mansion. Who's, not which one of you, I'm not asking the question, who in this room? But who is in the first mansion? What sorts of people? Do you remember?
Deaf and mute.
Yes. The deaf and the mute. Okay.
And people in mortal sin.
Yes. And what sort of mortal sin?
All kinds.
All kinds. Well, it's all of them. It's all of them. But what I mean is, the people in the first mansion, the people in the external courtyard, are what? They're jumping from sin to sin. And you hear me say all the time, do not be discouraged when you go to confession if you're confessing the same thing over and over again. Where do you think I got that from? Teresa of Avila. Because the people in the first mansion are jumping from sin to sin to sin. Right? This week might be sexual sin. The next week might be alcohol. The next week might be food. The next week might be pride. The next week might be cheating. The next week might be stealing. Don't jump from sin to sin to sin. Boil it down. And I don't mean pick a sin and stick with it. That's not what I mean either. But this first mansion is people who are full of sin. They're Why do you think they're deaf and mute? Who said deaf and mute? That was really good. Why?
Because it's saying that they don't even know. They are so engrossed in mortal sin that they don't even know
Yes.
that there is another side that
Yes.
they can get into the mansion.
Yes. They're so engrossed in mortal sin that they are oblivious to the fact that they're in a courtyard instead of walking into the building. They're deaf and they're mute. Another way of thinking about it, in the scriptures, when we come across Jesus healing deaf, blind, mute, or sleeping, what do those things mean, especially in the Gospel of St. Luke?
It was a type. It was talking about how we, the same thing with the beam in our eye. Before you can
Yes.
got to get the beam out.
Yes.
And it's that kind of
And that type is,
alliteration.
yes, but that type is specifically the spiritually dead.
Right.
The spiritually dead. So anytime in Scripture we hear of someone that's deaf, it means they can't hear God. So what's the problem? Sin. Anytime in the gospel we hear that they're blind, what is it? They can't see what God's doing. What's the problem? Sin. Anytime in the gospel someone's sleeping, what's the problem? Sin. What's the result? Wake up and look at God. So this plays out in particular parables and occasions in the gospel. This coming Sunday is Transfiguration. That's the gospel. And in the Transfiguration, I was praying with a prayer group last night. And I noticed something in the Transfiguration for the first time that I've never noticed. Here's a spoiler alert for my homily on Sunday. But Peter, James, and John go up Mount Tabor with Jesus. Jesus, while they're there, the cloud descends and rests, which should bring our minds back to Mount Sinai when Moses received the 10. Sinai and Tabor are the same mountain. Moses goes up the mountain, and what do the Israelites see? They see fire engulf the top of the mountain and engulf Moses. What does Moses see? He enters the cloud, and from the cloud he hears God's voice, and God hands him the 10 Commandments on the tablets. What are the Israelites doing? They're blind, right? They can't see the mountaintop. They can't see their prophet. So the Israelites are down below going, oh my goodness, this God called Yahweh has just destroyed our prophet. Let's build another God. And that's where the golden calf comes from. It's not just like they're bored. It's because they're afraid of Yahweh. So they build a new God, the golden calf, to kill Yahweh. That's really what that is, which is crazy. But then you have Jesus goes up the same mountain. And on top of the mountain, with Peter, James, and John, that same cloud engulfs the mountain peak, engulfs Jesus and Peter, James, and John. And who appears? Moses, who was on the mountain. Who else appears? Elijah. So you have Moses the law, Elijah the prophet. And this is what I've never noticed before on top of Mount Tabor in the Transfiguration. Peter, James, and John were asleep. They're dead. They're spiritually dead. They wake up and they don't know what's happening. Wake up. Okay. So in this first mansion, in this external courtyard, you have a bunch of deaf and blind people. They're unaware of what God is doing. At the Transfiguration, Peter, James, and John wake up to see and hear Jesus doing what? Talking about the exodus that he's going to accomplish in Jerusalem, not in Egypt, but the new exodus in Jerusalem. What is the exodus that is happening in this first mansion, or that is being prepared for in this first mansion? Well, the crucifixion is the means by which the exodus happens. The crucifixion takes, if you want to do a direct analogy, it would take the place of the plagues in the original Exodus. No, the Exodus is people stuck in sin to freedom from sin. Right? Just like the Israelites are enslaved to Pharaoh, and they have to pass through their exodus to get to the land of freedom, the promised land. And so now the new exodus is, I have to pass from my sin to my freedom. And if I'm in the courtyard and I'm blind and deaf, I'm not aware of what God is planning. I'm not aware of what God is calling me to. I'm not aware of where God is leading me because I'm blind and I'm deaf in my sin. Does that track? Okay, so what is the goal, or what is the advice for people who might find themselves in this first mansion? Pray and meditate. And what do people who are in the first mansion always resist? Prayer and meditation. If people just wake up, my job would be so much easier, right? If people just do what the doctor tells them to do, won't their lives just be easier, medically speaking? Okay, if you just do it, okay, so it's the same thing. It's just, and why do we resist prayer and meditation when we're in the first mansion?
Because they're in sin and they don't want to give that all up. It's sort of like
Yeah.
they're fighting it. Well, at least the way she wrote it, she
Yeah.
was saying that they are so encompassed in their own life and they are so much involved in everyday rituals of just, nothingness, but yet they're busy all the time. They don't have any time to pray and meditate because they say they don't have any time.
Right, they say they have no time to pray and meditate because they're so captivated with their worldly lives.
Right.
Yes. But is it that they don't want what comes from prayer and meditation?
No, because sometimes they do pray. There is
So what is it that keeps them? What really is it? Think, you can think in your own lives. I can think in my own life and pick this out. What is it that really keeps me from praying and meditating? It's not distractions. Okay, yeah, because it's a lot easier to watch something on TV than even for me to walk across the hallway to go to my chapel, where the Blessed Sacrament is reserved in my house. I have it easy, and I still sit on the couch instead of going into the chapel. But why? What keeps me?
It's hard to face yourself.
Yeah, it's hard to face the reality of my sin. I despise my sin. I am horribly ashamed of my sin, and I'm embarrassed by it. And my embarrassment of sin, and I'm ashamed to admit this, sometimes keeps me from going to confession even today. Not very long, it just becomes 10 days instead of 7, but but it still does that, and I'm ashamed to say that it even delays me 3 days. I'm ashamed to say the last time I was with another priest, not the last time, but a few times ago that I was with another priest, I avoided confession. He knows every sin I've ever confessed because he always hears my confession. And I didn't discover a new sin. Why did it take me seeing him 3 times before I went to confession?
they're afraid, in the way she wrote it too, was like they're afraid, the people in the first mansion are afraid to enter into themselves. They don't want to know their own soul.
Yeah. It's fear, right? It's fear of seeing what I've done, of admitting the faults that I have. It's fear of being seen. And the reason I'm afraid of being seen is because I'm so aware of sin that I'm afraid of someone else's sin hurting my sin, right? And it's a stupid thing that we project onto God. Another part of it too is that it's just uncomfortable. It is just uncomfortable. If I don't have a habit of meditation and daily prayer and sitting still and listening to God's voice, it is extremely uncomfortable. And we human beings are trained to not do things that are uncomfortable. It takes me an act of Congress to go to the dentist because I don't want someone's hand in my mouth, especially with a drill bit or a toothbrush that's yelling at me and squirting me. I don't want that. It's uncomfortable, but I force myself to do it. Well, the same is true in prayer. It's just uncomfortable because if I'm not in the habit, if I'm out there jumping from mortal sin to mortal sin, and all of a sudden I have to sit still. By the way, the image of jumping from mortal sin to mortal sin that's always been in my head since the first time I've read this first mansion is a flea. You ever watch a flea? Or a peacock? A peacock. Right? It can't. It's just constantly, is that going to kill me? 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 A peacock is terrified, and fleas just keep bouncing, and it's this image of chaos. It's not like this person in the first mansion is just sitting in one sin. What does Teresa say? They're bouncing from sin to sin, and they're among the vermin and the chaos and the wilderness and the animals and it's chaotic. It's tumultuous, and the person who's bouncing around like that, someone has to grab them by the shoulders and just sit down. And sometimes it takes a spiritual friend to do that, to start this process. Sit down. Yes, ma'am.
And is there also an aspect of like they don't have the relationship or experience or vision, and I'm not talking like spiritual vision, but like the vision of what this could look like
Yeah.
on in the mansions? Because she talks about, like, one of my favorite parts when she talks about like self-knowledge and humility doesn't come from just taking a microscope, the seeing eyeglass, like to ourselves, right? Like a microscope to ourselves.
Right.
And again and again. It truly comes from reflecting on God, and in
Yes.
reflecting on God, now
Yes.
I know my place. Now I know where my sin is. Instead of just getting mired in it. And so
Correct.
people in that mansion, they don't have the
Because what does all sin make me do? I always just put my face in my navel. Because all of my sin is about me looking at my desires, looking at my cravings, looking at my preference, looking at what I want, what I think, what I know to be right. And it's all about me, and I turn in on myself. And as St. Paul says, I become a worshiper of my belly. My belly has become my God. What is the person out in the courtyard doing? They're completely curled in on themselves, navel gazing. And what does Teresa say? Look at God. And so the temptation in the outer mansion is to over-evaluate myself. Well, why do I do this? Well, why do I do that? Well, why do I want this? And and it's still, it's a tweaked motivation for navel gazing, but it's still navel gazing. What's the solution? Stand erect, look up, see God's face. Ask God what he wants, exactly. And it's uncomfortable if you've been hunched over your whole life for someone to take your back and snap you upright, So again, it takes time. Yeah, so the overvaluation of self is a big part of it too. Okay, basically what Teresa is saying is the first mansion is an invitation to conversion. Whatever you're doing, start. Whatever you're going to do, start. And what is my first recommendation? Before you even go to prayer or the chapel or Mass, go to confession. Just start. Right? Because if you're jumping from mortal sin to mortal sin to mortal sin, you're covered in the filth of sin. Go get rid of the filth, then I'll talk to you. But before I can really talk to you, because you can't hear me, because you're deaf, right? You can't hear what I'm offering. You have to go to confession. And that's perhaps one of the hardest things about being a priest. People don't listen to what I'm trying to tell them is available. And why aren't they listening? Because they're deaf. And I just keep yelling at them to go to confession, but they can't hear me because they're deaf. I mean, they hear the words I'm saying, but they don't see the need for it because they're deafened to the reality. And something has to break through. It's God. God is the one to break through. I cannot, you cannot. It has to be God. He might use me or you, but God has to break through to this kind of a person. And perhaps that's why early in life this is a very hard book to pick up, because we're out there deaf and mute and dumb. And we all are. I mean, we've all been there. Every single one of us. Okay. All right.
Staying in a relationship with vermin.
Yeah, exactly. We're staying in a relationship with the vermin. Get away from the vermin. Right? And sometimes it's just a matter of, I need to change the people I spend my time around. You know? And that's a big motivation for trying to make the parish a community and not just a commodity of worship. Right? This can't just be an institution where we go to Mass. It also has to be a community. It has to be a family. Because this, if I'm inviting someone to the spiritual life, I have to invite them to something. I have to invite them to an expression of this. And if we're all pursuing holiness together, and that's why I keep saying, the more that we pursue holiness, in whatever small group it is, the more it'll affect the parish. Because it'll be a place where I can invite people. Excuse me. Excuse me. I don't know what I do with my water. Oh well. Okay. So knowledge of ourselves is very important, but you still have to relax with it. You still have to find humility. So the end of the first mansion is a seeking for humility. Okay, any other things that people want to point out? So what's the advice for people in the first mansion? Prayer, meditation, particularly she says on the Gospels, right? And I would add confession. Yes, self-knowledge, self-reflection. But not in a microscopic way, but just admitting, yeah, I am jumping. Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
I kept saying to come back into you, to know who God created you, why He created you.
Yes.
Don't fear yourself to not know yourself. You need to know who you
Yes.
are in the presence of God, because He made
Yes.
you to be. And that really hit home, because so often we talk to people, and I talk to myself, and I'm like, you know, I really sometimes, why am I here? But we all have a reason to be here. We have to understand that God is trying to convey that to us.
Yes, that's right. And if you notice, which is so sad, is the world is telling us the exact opposite. And you see concupiscent sin evident in society at large. Because whereas the church stands and says, look up to God and discover yourself. Don't be afraid of who God created you to be. The world says, define yourself. You tell me who you are. I don't know who I am. I didn't make me. God did. God knows who I am. I can't change myself. I can't become something that God didn't make me. And there's so much freedom. You know, I fought my vocation for years in high school. I tried so desperately to prove to God that I was called to be married. I dated, I won't say the number. I dated too many women in high school. It was absurd. And it was just this stupid adolescent desire to prove God wrong, because I was going to define who I am. I'm called to be married. I'm called to be successful. No, I'm not. What did God say? No, you're called to be a celibate. You're called to be my priest. And when I finally let go and allowed God to say that, I found freedom. Freedom. The world's going to tell me I'm not free. I'm more free today than I was at 16. Right? I found freedom. I found peace. When I allowed God to tell me who I was instead of dictating who I was. So yeah.
Patty knew that. Did you know that? Patty said he's meant to be a priest.
I never did know that.
Yes, you did. There you go.
We'll have to have that conversation later. All right, anything else from the first mansion before? Yes, ma'am.
She also says that if you want to go on, you'd be well advised to try to put aside all unnecessary affairs and business. In other words, you got to give
Yes.
yourself space.
Yes, thank you. I meant to put that, point that out.
And that's hard to do, actually.
Yeah, because my life is full. I mean, whose life is not full?
And doing good things.
I was just complaining about this to the people I was praying with last night. I am so busy that when I think about the parish, what do I think about? I think about money. I think about property. I think about numbers. I think about social events. I think about advertising. You know what and I'm lamenting that I fail like this. This is the sort of thing that I should be thinking about. Teaching people to pray. Praying myself on behalf of the parish.
Too many worldly things.
There's too many worldly things, but none of that's bad, right? I need to pay the church's bills, I hope, right? I mean, you don't want to sit here in a dark and cold room. You know what I mean? Like, I got to do all those things, but none of those things are evil, but they're not the matter. They're symptoms, not the matter. So yeah. So you have to pick something and say, not doing that. I have to let go of some things in my life to make room for prayer, to make room for God. You're right, absolutely.
The same things that people have in their own homes, you know.
Yeah,
The fathers and mothers and everybody have to survive, have to pay bills, have to do this, so you get distracted. We all get distracted that way.
right, okay.
Something Mother Teresa said, it was very sobering to me when, I mean, I'm not gonna quote her exactly, but basically she told her sisters, you have to spend 3 hours in front of the Blessed Sacrament before we go out there to the streets, because otherwise you're not bringing Jesus to them, you're bringing you to them.
Yes. Yeah, it doesn't, yeah. And I think too often in the church, we get put into polarized categories. We're either traditionalists, and we're all about the rosary and prayer and adoration and mass, or we're all about social justice and taking care of the poor and feeding the hungry. And Catholicism is neither one of those. It's both. It's the liturgy flowing into my good works, and it's my good works pulling me into the liturgy. And if I'm not doing both, then I'm not living an authentic Catholic life. I have to have both. I have to have a good understanding of liturgy and prayer, and then that prayer has to throw me into the streets to work. It has to be both. Yeah. Okay. Second mansion. What sorts of people, do you remember, are in that second mansion?
Beginning to hear.
They're starting to, yes. They're beginning to have hearing. They're becoming awake. They're waking up. All right. Anybody have anything that stands out in the second mansion before I start?
I don't know which mansion it was in, but there was somewhere where she mentioned, there was some trouble with melancholy.
Melancholy? I think that's, if I'm remembering correctly, I think that's the third one. Is that right? Yeah, that's the third mansion.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
Well, she did say that the people in the second mansion it's harder for them than the first because they understand.
Yes.
They can't get past, and do all the right things, but they understand and it's where they need to push forward.
They're aware of it, but it's
Right.
they get pulled back to the first mansion.
Right. It's a spiritual tug of war. It's
Perseverance to pray and do penance and.
It seems to me too that most of people that I encounter are in the first two. Most people in the world are in the first two mansions, just bluntly. They're either jumping around and scurrying about in mortal sin, or they're really on fire and then they're cold, and then they're really on fire and they're cold, and they're doing this whole dance in the church, and they'll come into the church for a year or so, and they'll be the biggest and loudest volunteer, then they kind of fall away, and then you don't see them and then they come back and they're the biggest volunteer, and then they kind of fall away, and then you watch it. I mean, in parish life, you just watch it, and it happens, and you see it. And it should move your heart to pity, not to judgment. It should say, oh my goodness, I just want to pull them all the way in. Get in here. But no, and it's harder. You're right to say that the second mansion is harder than the first because you're aware that the sin has its stronghold in you. And it's a pitiable position, and I don't want to be in it. And sometimes I feel like I've backtracked all the way to the second mansion. And maybe that's part of this book, is that I'm not always in, sometimes maybe for a period of time in mansion 7, and then I can fall all the way back to 2, and then I'm in 4, and then I jump around. Yes, because why? I'm not a science experiment. I'm a human being, right? And I go back and forth. I do. And so, yes, this is a real sense of tug of war. of I see the good that the Lord offers me. I see the good available in the church, but I really like this sin over here. But I want what God has. Oh, but this is comfortable, and I like this, but I'm so addicted to sin, and it's this. Yes, it's horrible. It's torture. The second mansion can be a really torturous place to be, and it's dangerous. And this is where a lot of people will fall permanently because it's too hard, and they give up. So what does Teresa suggest to those people? Pray harder, but there's something really, really interesting. Perseverance, but there's even something really, really important here.
Meditation, recollection.
Yeah? Humility, even more. Companionship, right? A companion. Go find someone who is well-versed in the spiritual life, who's more advanced than you. Go find them and let them walk with you. Tell them of your struggles and ask them to pray with you. A spiritual companion. So if you find yourself in the second mansion, the thing to do is to reach out and say help. Because if you have someone pulling you further into the spiritual life, it's harder to backtrack because you have more strength. And on the other hand, too, if you find yourself past the second mansion, you are called to go get them because you are that spiritual companion. And this is doable. And again, another reason to build the parish to be more than a commodity of a place of worship, but a community. So that when somebody begins the spiritual life and they stop jumping from sin to sin to sin, and now they're playing the tug-of-war game of falling in and going in and falling out and going in, now we have a community built up. And if we have a strong community in there and we can invest them into a prayer group like the Legion of Mary, the Men of St. Joseph, or a service group like the Knights of Columbus, or something that I want to start next year, the Dad's group in the school, or, all these different things, the Rieza Club, with all sorts of things. Great. But then we have to stop looking at only ourselves and look at the new people that are around us on the peripheries of the parish and go, come here. Come pray with us because we're working together, right? Come with us. That's, practically speaking, where the spiritual companionship happens. Or even in your own personal lives outside of the parish. There's a couple people, I'm very, very excited to hear this. There's a couple people in this parish who have begun to do this naturally in their own personal lives. They meet someone who has always been intrigued by Catholicism, but never considered becoming Catholic. Or they're suffering a loss in their lives and they don't know where to turn. And so there's a couple people, I don't want to name them, but there's a couple people in the parish who have been really good about going out and saying, okay, wait, come here, let's talk. Let me give you some advice. Come, the code to the Adoration Chapel. Here's the code, it's 032500. Go in there anytime you want. And just go sit. It's just a quiet place to sit. And they start walking, and then after a while, that person will say, well, what more is there? And then they say, well, why don't we meet with Father? And then that person brings them to me. And then all of a sudden, we have an OCIA that begins to get filled. Why? Because there's a spiritual companionship of people saying, you're entering the curiosity phase of spiritual life. Let me accompany you and bring you here. It's not me, right? We're not going to have a giant OCIA because I'm in the streets just grabbing every person I see. That's not possible. What is possible? We build a good base of prayers, of those who pray. We have a good base of those who know the Lord and can accompany people into the faith. So it's a both and. If you find yourself in the tug of war, reach out for help. If you see someone in the tug of war, grab them and hold on tight. Make sense? Okay. Another thing of a piece of advice that she gives, and this is hard. This is a very hard piece of advice. She says to embrace the cross. Embrace the cross. I have a portrait of Pope St. John Paul II in my office. He's in the picture, he's begun to suffer his Parkinson's. It's not very advanced yet. And I forget where the picture is taken, but it's an outdoor mass and the wind is blowing and his vestments are furling behind him. And he's holding his ferula, the Pope's staff, which is a cross, and he's holding it with two hands, and you see pain in his face, and he's bearing into it. That really is an image of the spiritual life. And it's the cross, and it's fear of the cross that causes us to go back out among the vermin. Because at least out there, I didn't know that I hurt. What does she say? Embrace it. And what do I say? Meet Jesus on the cross. Don't avoid it. You know, there are great sufferings in my life. And those great sufferings are great opportunities for me to know Jesus. And sometimes I'm really good at it. And most of the time I'm awful at it. But whenever you and I encounter a cross and we can actually embrace it, I meet Jesus on the cross. And I know him because of my cross. I go back time and again to the Easter Vigil and singing the Great Exultet every year. And my favorite line, "Oh, happy fault, oh truly necessary sin of Adam, that won for us so great, so marvelous a Savior." My cross, my sin, reminds me that I need a Savior. Because without my suffering, I become proud. Because without my suffering, I think I can do it on my own. My suffering reminds me, I cannot save me. And so to use the suffering and that torment and that torture in the second mansion as a way to cling to Jesus, to cling to him. And that is a very hard reality. But it is oh so beautiful when it becomes efficacious.
Yeah, sickness and illnesses and sufferings take you closer to him.
And betrayals and storms and mistakes and shame, all of it. If you let it. If you let it. Because all of those things can also cause you to become bitter and filled with hatred. If you do it right, it causes your growth. If you do it wrong, it causes your furling in, your navel gazing. The other thing that she says is daily fidelity to his will. All the beginner in prayer has to do is to labor and be resolute and prepare himself with the possible diligence to bring his will into conformity with the will of God. To be resolute about it, and to ask God and to pray with that question. Lord, what is it that you desire? Lord, what is it that you want me to do? Lord, show me the desires of your heart. Lord, teach me to love the things that you love. Lord, teach me to love your plan. Lord, teach me to love your law. Teach me to delight in your law. Right? That sort of daily persistence and fidelity to his divine will. Okay. She also insists on persistence. My mom always calls me persistent as an insult. I am so stubborn, if you haven't figured that one out. Sometimes it's a great quality and sometimes it's awful. When I'm right, it's amazing. And when I'm wrong, it's the worst, right? But be persistent, right? And this is what I mean. Because, again, when I'm in spiritual desolation, what's the temptation? To stop praying. Why? Because if I'm in desolation, prayer is more awkward. It becomes more uncomfortable. In fact, it can be painful. And so what's the temptation when prayer is uncomfortable and not desirable? To not do it. And people say silly things all the time, like, "Oh, Father, meditation is just not for me." Yes, it is. That's your sin talking. That is your sin talking. Knock it off. It is for you. You just don't like it. And I don't care. I had this professor in major seminary in theology. He was teaching Christology. You might have heard me tell this story before, and that's okay. I don't care. It's a great story. Father Guy Mancini, he taught Christology. And I was sitting next to a seminarian from another diocese. We had a shared table in class. And let's just call him Billy Bob. That's not his name. But Billy Bob sitting next to me raised his hand, and we were talking about Christology and talking about the reading the night before. Christology is the study of what Christ is. And so he raises his hand. He says, Father Guy, I think Christ, da-da-da, and he spouted off something. And Father Guy got so mad. And he's holding the Christology text, and he slams it on the floor, and he's a Benedictine, so he throws his scapular over his shoulder, and he throws his foot up on the table, and he puts his finger in Billy Bob's face, and he goes, I don't give a damn what you think. And then he goes, I don't give a damn what I think. I only give a damn what Holy Mother Church thinks. Now shut up and read your Christology. And then he calmed down. And a few minutes later, he goes, look, here's the thing. I don't care what you like. I don't care about your opinion. I don't care what my opinion is. It doesn't change reality. And the reality is that I was created for unity with Christ. So read the Christology, learn the truth, and live it. Well, Billy Bob left seminary. So maybe that's not the greatest. Well, I think he should have been a priest, but anyway. But in a certain sense, when people say things like, well, meditation's not for me, I just don't like adoration, I'm like, I just want to channel Father Guy and be like, I don't care. I don't. You got to do it. Because we were created for unity with God, and this is how unity with God is founded. And sometimes it's uncomfortable. And sometimes I just want to give up. What's the answer? To pray more. I love going back to Fulton Sheen. I think he's a brilliant man and a holy man. He used to talk about how it was necessary for people, lay and cleric alike, to pray a holy hour every day, which means 60 minutes of mental prayer. And this woman raised her hand. She said, Bishop, I'm a mother of 4, and I work. I don't have 60 minutes to pray. I'm too busy. And he looked at her and he said, Madam, then you must pray 65 minutes today. Where do you think your strength comes from? Where do you think your ability to raise your children comes from? Where do you think your ability to run a parish comes from? Doesn't come from you. It comes from God. And so it's that persistence in prayer of saying it does not matter what my day puts in my face. It matters that I come before Him. It matters that I take time in mental prayer, no matter how dry or wonderful it is. It just matters that I'm there. It does not matter if I feel connected. It does not matter if I like it. It matters that I am there. Persistence, persistence, persistence. And if I fail, and I do fail, and if I fall, and I do fall, there's no reason to lose heart, but to continue to make a serious effort towards progressing to the interior castle, to the mansion of God. When God sees that I fail, but I persevere nonetheless, He blesses it and transforms it. So on those days where I do fail, and I go and I turn on Netflix or Hulu or HBO or whatever I'm watching that day, and I failed to go to the chapel across the hall for my holy hour, and then the next day I wake up, and instead of scrolling through the news or listening to a podcast or taking care of the dog, I go and I spend my first fruits of the day in the chapel. God sees that, and He blesses the failure the day before. Persistence. Okay. Anything else about the... Oh, we're at an hour. Shoot. All right, anything else about the second mansion? What we'll do is we'll do 3 and 4 next week. But anything else about that second mansion? Please. Yeah.
Mother St. Paul, I used to pray all the time when I was in And
I think that's a great prayer.
I had some pretty lofty goals, and I prayed that prayer every night for 10 years. And a couple of things kind of came out of that too. Is that I never did anything for me that I could do myself. And that's why all of the workouts, you know, whether you're alone, whether you're with other people, you gotta put the time in. You just, unless you gotta put 90% of the effort in. Because it's a little bit misleading, I think, when people come out and say, oh, I prayed for this and God gave it to me. I think, you know, I read about Lapas's dignity of causation, you know, where he says, if we really have a relationship with God, what we do has to have an effect. We can't
Yeah.
just be living God's will and that's God's will and that's how it happens. We have to have a say in that.
Yeah.
I think the same thing applies here. It's not enough to say, oh God, I want to have a better relationship with you, or
Yes.
I want you to heal me from this illness, or I want you to fix this relationship I have with my child. You have to have the faith and the persistence to act diligently and directly
Yes.
to do the things that he wants to do as best as you can understand the things that he wants you to do.
That's right. I think you're absolutely right. So, you know, what good does it do if I wake up every day and say, Lord, make me a saint today? Versus I just spend an hour with him. And I might start my hour with make me a saint, but then I spend the next 59 minutes and 50 seconds listening. Those are two different realities. Absolutely. Or what good does it do if I pray every morning? If I'm an alcoholic and I pray every morning, Lord, take away my alcoholism, heal me of alcoholism. But I keep a case of Jack Daniels in the pantry. What good does that do? I have to do something. I have to get rid of the Jack. I can't keep a case in the house and then beg God to take away my addiction. It doesn't work that way. Or it's more pointedly, as St. Augustine says it, grace builds on nature. And so if I don't give God the nature to build on, he has nothing to build on. I have to do something. I have to cooperate. And I think that's why Father Gitter, when I was in college seminary and he was my spiritual director, he always would say, Nicholas, you got to do 10% of the work, God will do 90. And I'd say, okay, what's my 10? He goes, show up for holy hour. You're not there. All you have to do is be there. You have to be persistent. Just show up. You know, and I hate going to the gym. But once I'm there, guess what I'm doing? I'm working out. What's the only thing I have to do really to work out regularly? Drive 7 minutes. You know, once I'm there, I'm there. I'm all in. But I find every excuse not to drive. You know, so yeah, you're absolutely right. You have to show up. You know, if your prayer every day is, Lord, make my opponents weaker than me, but you're eating Cheetos in a beanbag chair playing video games, every opponent will be stronger than you. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Also, I think that's a beautiful prayer to carry into adulthood past athletics. Lord, make my opponents weaker than I. Knowing that your opponents are not with flesh and blood, but with principalities and powers. Lord, make my opponents weaker than I. Lord, make me strong enough to do your will. Absolutely. Thank you. Any other? Okay. I knew I said that we were going to do the first 3 mansions tonight. I kind of had a feeling that we might only do 2. My goal is to, when we get into the later mansions, to only be doing 1 a night, because the mansions get more intense as we go. So next week we will do mansions 3 and 4. And then the following week, hopefully it's just 5, but I got to make sure I counted correctly for the weeks of Lent. We will meet Wednesday of Holy Week. So that will be the last one is Wednesday of Holy Week, which 19, 18, which I think is the 16th of April. Whatever the closest Wednesday to the 16th is. Okay, so 16th of April will be the last one. So every Wednesday between now and then. Good?
Is this good? Critiques, criticisms, tomatoes? Nothing?
6 o'clock, right? is-
6 o'clock, that's right. It's just because I really apologize. I double booked myself. I forgot that I had First Confessions tonight. So I had to bump this, but
Of which I tried to go to. I was so excited. Got the text message, and I left my husband that was feeding him, fed him fast, came trying to go to confession. Mother said, Karen, where are you going? I said, I'm going to confession before Sunday.